professor here at CU. Ivan's been at CU for 7 years, I guess, something like that. He was a student at Kent with Ola. Then he did a postdoc at Urbana and came here 7 years ago. Ivan is well known for his work, beautiful work in liquid crystals and colloids, and particularly creating breathtaking structures, topological structures that he will tell you about. He's a recipient of most notably PCASE Award, which is the Presidential Young Career Award, which is very selective, given to young researchers starting in the field across physics. And so today he's going to tell us about topology of colloids.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to share with you some of our research results. I guess by now you already all know that liquid crystals are not just those interesting materials that provide the ability of displaying information in your iPhones and computer screens, but they can be a medium, social medium for bacteria that Oleg showed you, where they can swim and interact with each other until, of course, he shuts the oxygen for them. You also saw in the Knowles talk that maybe DNA was, maybe liquid crystals were involved in engineering DNA as well. In my talk, I will discuss how liquid crystals and colloids, another soft matter system, can allow us to study and pose and answer different questions related to topology, and therefore also related to different branches of science. So the work that I will present was done by many members of our research group. Here you can see a selection of pictures from our group hikes, and you have a chance to meet them both during some of those lectures, and here they are attending the summer school lectures as well, and also during the lab tour that we'll have right after the lunchtime today. So if you did not sign for one of those for this tour, please join. It's still possible. We have an ability to demonstrate you how we do those experiments that I'll present you today. And so, as we all know, topology really penetrates different branches of science, right? And here you can see just a couple pictorial examples from very different branches of physics, and the pictures in some ways can look very similar, although phenomena and different types of physics are very different, but still there is this common language of topology. And what I will try to show you today is that liquid crystals and colloids can be a test ground, can be a model system to study interplay of topology of surfaces, fields, and topological defects, can allow us to probe how we can realize three-dimensional topological solitons and different kinds of knotted fields that may potentially impinge on our understanding of other branches of science as well. And so I'll start from introducing different techniques related to imaging, manipulation, fabrication, as well as some aspects of topology. And then in the first part of my talk, I'll discuss the interplay of topologies of surfaces, fields, and defects. In the second part, we'll discuss different types of three-dimensional solitons. And so in the work I'll present, it's extremely important to be able to image molecular alignment fields, and Oleg already presented different ways of doing this in his talk. What we will do in the experiments that I'll present is we will utilize two different approaches in visualizing director fields in 3 dimensions that do not involve doping different dyes. So in one case, we can use self-fluorescence of liquid crystal molecules, such as 5-CB pentylcyanobiphenyl that you can see in here. This fluorescence will be polarization dependent because the transition dipole moments are along the long axis of those molecules. In the other case, we will be also using the Raman signals, but stimulated Raman signals, so much stronger than conventional Raman, that will come from different chemical bonds, such bonds like CN bond in the very same molecule that are co-aligned with liquid crystal molecules and therefore also with the director field. And those types of images in 3 dimensions are realized using experimental techniques that you will have a chance to see in the lab. You can see some of the pictures in here. Those techniques allow us to do label-free 3-dimensional chemically specific imaging of liquid crystal director fields in 3 dimensions. And this can be done, what's important, along with also non-contact optical manipulation of those fields, defects, and colloidal objects that we will put in liquid crystals. Also what's important is that we can do those different types of imaging at the same time, which means they all have different complementary capabilities. And so as we will utilize different types of nonlinear optical imaging techniques, we will take advantage of those. Let me very briefly introduce the nonlinear optics principles behind the capabilities of those techniques. So typically when we would have a molecule like 5-CB in here, we can get fluorescence from it if we excite it in the ultraviolet part of optical spectrum, say at 327 nanometers, right? But you can understand that UV optics is very complicated and expensive, and it's difficult to do it this way. So instead, we can utilize 2-photon or 3-photon absorption processes, in which case we can use visible or infrared laser light, femtosecond laser light, at much longer wavelengths, so that we can excite those molecules through 2-photon absorption or 3-photon absorption processes, and then yet still get fluorescence from them at a shorter wavelengths, right? And here, in a similar spectral range as you would get if you were to excite in the UV. Now, it's important to remember that for you to be able to get this fluorescence as a result of multiphoton absorption, you need to have femtosecond or picosecond laser source because the photons need to be collocated in space and time, and for that you need very large instantaneous laser powers, although the average laser power can be very low. And so as we will use those different types of multiphoton excitation, the fluorescence light will be dependent on polarization of the intensity of fluorescent light will be dependent on polarization of the excitation laser beam relative to the orientation of liquid crystal director. And so depending on the order of nonlinear process that we use, whether it's second or third order nonlinear process, so 2-photon or 3-photon absorption-based fluorescence, for example, we will have those relations between linear polarization of excitation light and the intensity of the signal that we will detect, which we can detect either through another polarizer or without using polarizing filters in the detection channel. And so importantly, no dyes are needed in this type of imaging. Yeah?
So just for your multiphoton absorption scheme, I wondered, is there, because I understand you said that the photons have to be coexistent spatially for this to work, but at the same time, the narrower the pulse, the less well-defined their frequency would be, right?
Oh, well, that's true, but you do not need to be too narrow frequencies. So there is a pretty broad spectrum of absorption. Yeah. Yeah?
These actually electronic transitions in the liquid crystal molecule itself?
Right, yeah.
Okay. And the other question is, in practice, how much, now when you go to nonlinear process, it's much weaker. So to get it, that you can still detect, how much stronger is the
So the average power can be milliwatt, and it's actually comparable or even lower than what you use in a regular confocal microscopy, for example. But the pulses are very short, femtosecond, say in our case 140 femtosecond pulses, and that provides you instantaneous power many orders of magnitude larger, which makes this the probability of this process pretty large. And so, as I already mentioned, the big advantage of this process is that there is very strong dependence of emitted light on polarization of excitation laser beam. And so, as we already discussed, in addition to the fact that we now need no dyes for three-dimensional imaging, we also have intrinsic three-dimensional resolution, because the probability of this process is highly dependent on the intensity of excitation light. And this intensity of excitation light, as you focus the laser beam with a high numerical aperture objective, will quickly drop away from the focal point, right? And so in the two-photon absorption-based process, we therefore excite fluorescence only very locally next to the focal point of the laser beam, unlike in the case of classical single photon based process. Moreover, we will be able to excite the system using long wavelength light and detect a shorter wavelengths, which is convenient to get better resolution, but also we do not need a pinhole to get a three-dimensional resolution, because this process is intrinsically three-dimensionally resolved. So the other process that we utilize is coherent anti-Stokes Raman scattering microscopy, which is utilizing two different pico or femtosecond laser sources, and they are different frequencies, pump frequency and Stokes frequency. Then we typically tune the beat frequency to the difference of the vibration frequency of chemical bond of interest, and this allows us then to obtain anti-Stokes Raman scattering at a frequency which is defined by this simple expression. So 2 omega pump probe minus omega Stokes. And so this is a third order nonlinear process, and whenever we get this match of the difference between pump and Stokes frequency being equal to the intrinsic vibration frequency of chemical bond, we get strong Raman scattering. Now, in addition to this approach where we deal with a single Raman line, we can also do broadband coherent anti-Stokes Raman scattering, in which case we have the Stokes beam being broadband, pretty spread over a broad part of optical spectrum, and then we can also detect car signals that correspond to different chemical bonds. The other approach is so-called stimulated Raman scattering polarizing microscopy, which is very similar to CARS in the sense that you again have pump and Stokes frequencies of excitation laser light, but in this case we have to modulate one of those laser beams and then detect what are the differences of another beam in intensity as it passes through the sample, right? So they're here collocated in the sample in space and time, and then as we modulate one of those two beams, so in this case it's Stokes, we then detect the result in modulation of the pump beam. And so this, again, as we will now scan the laser beams through the sample, allows us to utilize the second-order nonlinear optical process in detecting the spatial changes of orientation of liquid crystal director field. So this is a schematic showing you how this different type of imaging is implemented using a Ti-5 femtosecond laser source. In here we have a photonic crystal fiber, which allows us to obtain supercontinuum, and then different types of optics in here allows us to select different colors of femtosecond laser light that then is brought to the sample in here, tightly focused, and then we can detect car signals or SRS signals or multiphoton absorption-based fluorescence signals in either forward or backward detection geometry. Now, what's important is that we also, in the very same optical setup, we also realize holographic laser tweezers, right? So the very same sample that's studied using this three-dimensional nonlinear optical microscopy can be also manipulated using holographic laser tweezers that in here you can see implemented using a liquid crystal spatial light modulator and a CW infrared laser source. So with the help of laser tweezers, you can manipulate many different objects like defects or colloidal particles. And so in here you can see different colloidal particles that are held by the laser beams in the sample that you can also image at the same time. Now, as you probably know, the laser tweezers allow you to control really well the translational degrees of freedom. Right, so you can move objects in 3 dimensions and measure forces between them and so on, but not so well in terms of rotational degrees of freedom. And so to be able to do that as well, we utilize holonomic magnetic and optical system that you can see in here. So then you simply mount additional set of coils that will allow you to apply magnetic fields in any direction in 3D, because we can run the currents through those coils with different phase, and through that define the directionality of magnetic field. And note that at the very same time, you can also control those particles using holographic laser tweezers, and it's all can be mounted on the very same system I just showed to you, so we can also do 3-dimensional imaging as well. And so let me show you how we can manipulate defect lines in liquid crystal using a dimer of super paramagnetic particles in here, which we can twist in different ways in 3 dimensions, while we are also manipulating those particles using laser tweezers and at the same time also magnetic holonomic control system. Yeah.
I just want to ask, so these are now short pulses. So you're really seeing, you're really seeing just integrated.
This is regular bright field microscopy, because we want to show everything at once as it happens as we manipulate those particles with laser tweezers. But in order to do imaging of what happens in 3D, at the very same time we can do 3-dimensional nonlinear optical imaging, which I'm about to present.
And there, it's, all I'm saying is that in comparison with a continuous wave, you're really seeing pulses, but they're coming often enough that it looks like to an eye.
Yeah, the repetition rates are at tenths of kilohertz rate.
Okay, so it just looks like
So now, as you saw one of those defects being controlled in here, you saw the structures which we are creating, and you might ask, what do they correspond to? In order to know that, we can do 3-dimensional imaging with different types of techniques I described, like multiphoton fluorescence based, and we can obtain cross-sections of such sample with the particle and defect along different lines in here. And you can see different cross-sections at the lines 1 to 3 correspond to some director structure. Then we can also obtain a cross-section along this line in here. And from a set of images of this kind, using the simple rules I discussed, we can then reconstruct the complicated pattern of defect lines that we created and the director field that's surrounding them. Right? So this is just experimental tool to study the director patterns of interest for us that we will use throughout my talk. But in addition, what's important in the study that I'll present is to be able to manipulate different types of colloidal particles. And so here I show how we can fabricate non-spherical colloidal particles, for example, with the shape of colloidal rings. So this is actually very similar to photolithography that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. We will start with a silicon wafer, then deposit different types of films. Then we can define the shape, by direct laser writing and etching the photoresist. And then in the end, as we remove this release layer, we can, for example, obtain silica particles that then can be redispersed in a liquid crystal medium. But with this approach, as you can understand, we are limited somewhat in terms of geometric shapes we can define. Yep?
I was going to ask what size variables
So it's all depends on photolithography. You can go a little bit submicron, and there are other approaches that allow us to obtain 10 to 100 nanometer sized particles as well. Actually, I have a little homework / discussion assignment for you to think about this. In order to be able to fabricate three-dimensional complex shapes, we use two-photon photopolymerization. In this case, we use a femtosecond laser source, the very same as we use for imaging. And this laser beam is tightly focused into a sample which is filled with monomeric fluid that contains photoinitiator. And we can excite this photoinitiator through a two-photon absorption process. That means this is also, again, spatially resolved in 3 dimensions. And then we can move the sample or the objective in 3 dimensions to define different geometric or topological shapes. So in here you can see a model that we generated using a computer that was then implemented in building this kind of colloidal particles that you can see in here. Now, yet even this technique has some limitations, and so we keep developing new ones. Another one is actually utilizing reduction of colloidal graphene oxide flakes. And so you might all know already that graphene oxide is very similar to graphene. It's essentially a single atomic sheet of carbon, as you can see in here. But in here you additionally have oxygen and hydrogen containing groups on its surface, which make those flakes dispersible in polar fluids like water. And moreover, as you disperse them in relatively high concentrations, just because the size of those flakes laterally is half a micron, for example, or you can control it, then at relatively low volume fractions, you can obtain liquid crystalline discotic nematic phases. And so in here you can see birefringence in different types of liquid crystal sample. That's coming because of that liquid crystalline ordering as you view those samples between cross polarizers. Well, it depends. You can control it. You typically want to be in a range where you have them soluble enough and in water. And then I will show you that we can reduce this in a continuous way, never 100%, right, eliminate them. But chemically, you can control the degree of oxidation. Typically, those groups are relatively sparse, right, still on the surface. So maybe every 1 in 100 atoms would have some of those oxygen, hydrogen containing groups. All right, so now we can use a femtosecond laser source to reduce graphene oxide flakes. And so if you were to measure absorbance of graphene oxide dispersion in water, you would see that here at the wavelengths of the femtosecond laser source, there is pretty much no absorption, so no single photon absorption, but we can have 2 photon and 3 photon absorption. As we do it, as we scan the laser beam, we reduce graphene oxide. So we eliminate those oxygen and hydrogen containing groups from the surface of graphene oxide flakes. And this makes them much less soluble in water, so those graphene flakes want to collapse on top of each other. Now you can scan this laser beam point by point, and with that, you can create a solid object inside of this fluid dispersion, right? So you can see in here an example of this trefoil colloidal microparticle, which is based of this reduced graphene oxide, and everywhere around you still have a colloidal dispersion of graphene oxide flakes, right? Now, yes, this is a solid object, which you can redisperse in a different medium. You can do SEM studies of it and so on. Oh, this is a discotic nematic. There is no polar or there is no columnar ordering, but there is nematic-like ordering. Yes, it's still around. Yeah, that's the beauty of it, right? You have it in nematic, and you can do some additional studies on it. Yeah. More questions?
Nematic is around the membranes of the sheets, the flakes form nematic phase.
Yeah.
And then
You can make it 2 micron, 5 micron, 20 micron. Well, small, it's essentially the features, right? You can do pretty well in 1 dimension, right? Because flakes collapse anisotropically. So you can go to tens or 100 nanometers. In the other lateral dimension, you are diffraction limited, right? So same kind of limitations as in a 2-photon polymerization process. Best you can do there around 200 nanometers or so. In terms of the cross-section of this tube, yeah? It is like polymerizing, you are solidifying it, right? But the process is different because you simply removed oxygen, hydrogen containing groups, which are charged groups. Those were providing colloidal stability, right? Because particles were electrostatically repelling from each other due to screened electrostatic interactions. As you remove them, then they collapse on top of each other, and you made a solid continuous object.
This is like a graphitic sort of.
Right. Yes, and you know what I was showing before, it is also like 3D printing. It is 3D printing, but on small scales.
When I missed, so first, if you had a regular nematic, conventional nematic, what could you do this as well or not? Like
If you disperse graphene oxide in it, Probably yes. We can try it in 5CB next time, but we still didn't try.
So this knot is bound though by the van der Waals forces, or like the interlayer forces.
That attract each other.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So now for your discussions later on during lunchtime and after the lab tour, think how you could fabricate those different complex geometric shapes of colloidal particles. What approaches would you use? All right. So now I would like to discuss the interplay of the liquid crystal director field with topology of non-trivial colloidal surfaces. So what we will be doing is we will introduce different colloidal particles into liquid crystal medium while being able to define the surface boundary conditions to be perpendicular or tangential to the surface of particles depicted in here. Now, we can make particles out of liquid crystal itself, right? And so what you see in here is a colloidal microparticle that's made out of elastomer, similar to liquid crystalline elastomer, that can be controlled by laser light, and so you can then control the shape of particle inside of liquid crystal medium. So as you can see, when you do this, not only you deform the shape of the particle, but you also deform director field around the liquid crystal. This is because there is a surface anchoring of the liquid crystal director outside of the particle and the surface of the particle. So they are mechanically coupled. Now, yeah. They are not. The object is driving it.
So the object is much more stiff.
Right. Although it's a liquid crystal elastomer that it's made of. So it's not very stiff too. So there is director in the interior of the particle and also in the exterior. But as you control the particle shape, the director in exterior is following. Well, it might be, but one would need to develop a system like that. All right, but what? No, those are rigid. We don't morph them like in here. Would not twist, no. All right, so but the purpose of this slide in here is just to show you that you can couple, right, the surface of the particle with the liquid crystal director field due to surface anchoring that Oleg discussed with you in details. And so what we will be interested in is introducing complex shapes of particles with non-trivial topology into the liquid crystal medium. And so I believe all of you know that the surfaces like donut and coffee mug can be deformed to each other, right? This is how this could happen. But you could not deform a surface of sphere, for example, to that of a donut, right? So those are topologically distinct from each other. And you can characterize topology of different types of two-dimensional surfaces using the so-called Euler characteristic that, again, was already introduced by Oleg. And here you see, again, the classic definition of it. And so, again, you can see that the objects like pyramids, cubes, and spheres would have the same Euler characteristic, but donut would have a different one, right? And so now we already know that the topology of the surface of particles matters, and this stems already from well-known theorem that tells us it's impossible to comb the vector field on the surface of a spherical object like in here. If you try to do it on one side, you rotate it to the other side, and you can see you created an object. And Oleg already discussed with you how this results in different types of defects in spherical droplets and also around spherical particles. You can also imagine how exactly this happens if you look at a coconut. Maybe Leo could request those for dessert, and you could examine them. But what we will discuss is a little bit more general theorem, which is called Poincaré-Hopf theorem, which tells us the similar kind of relation between the topological charge of the defect that you induce in a field interacting with a surface as a function of the topology of the particle surface. And so this topology can be described using genus, which is essentially the number of holes you have, or the Euler characteristic that we already introduced, and it's related in this simple way to the genus of the particle. And so you also already learned about the topological defects in 2 dimensions. Remember, those are stable and possible when you have a 2-dimensional director field or vector field. In here, the winding numbers of such defects are again shown for you again to remind. Remember that some of those defects would not be stable, like for example, integer ones in 3 dimensions, but in 2 dimensions they are. You remember what the winding numbers or strengths of defect lines are and how they are defined. So now if you take a spherical particle and you have 2 Bourgeois in here, you can see already how this how topological constraints work, because we inevitably have 2 + 1 defects in the 2-dimensional director field at the interface of the solid particle and the liquid crystal director field around it. Right? Those are the 2 Bourgeois at the poles along the liquid crystal director field far away from the particle. Now, what about a ring-shaped particle? So in here you can see a particle that has the shape of a donut, which is introduced into liquid crystal and aligns with the ring perpendicular to the far-field director. There are no defects observed. Right? So if you do 2-dimensional imaging between cross-polarizers or 3-dimensional imaging obtaining all kinds of cross-sections, all you detect is continuous deformations of the director field around. And then you can also do numerical modeling by minimizing the free energy. And again, you can see that everywhere there are just continuous deformations of director field. And the director can go continuously from far field direction, which is orthogonal to this ring, to the surface where it's parallel to the ring, and in this annular direction as depicted in here. Right? So if you would now look at the cross section, you would see that director is twisting and bending and continuously deforming to satisfy tangential boundary conditions on the surface of particle. So there are no defects, and we did not expect them, because Euler characteristic of a ring is 0. That means you do not need to introduce topological defects, but for a different particle, you can see those defects, right? And so in here you can see another particle which is aligned with the plane of the ring parallel to the far-field liquid crystal director, and in there you can see 4 Bourgeois, the surface point defects, right? And again, you can do 3-dimensional imaging. So those are pictures between cross polarizers with additional phase retardation plate, no polarizers. And in here you have 3-photon absorption-based fluorescence imaging, right, with different directions of polarization of excitation light that are overlaid on top of each other, and different cross-sectional images from which you can deduce the 3-dimensional director field around this colloidal object. And you realize that you have 4 Bourgeois in here and they have opposite charges, opposite winding numbers, +1 and -1, and they mutually self-compensate each other, right? So still, despite the fact that you have those bosoms in here, they all add to the net winding number in two-dimensional director field at the interface of particle and liquid crystal. They add to 0, right? And so why is it that they appear in this system? Actually, the particles which are aligned like this with 4 bosoms appear much more often than the ones without bosoms, right? So it turns out that this has to do with the minimization of free energy, because all of those distortions of director field that we have seen in here cost elastic energy, right? It turns out that elastic energy due to distortions of this type, despite the fact that you introduce topological defects, is lower. And so as you would then plot the free energy as a function of an angle between the plane of the ring and the far-field liquid crystal director, you would see that this actually makes sense, right? You can see that the structure with bosoms, when the ring plane is parallel to far-field director, corresponds to minimum of free energy, and then we can have a local minimum for the particle at perpendicular orientation when you have no bosoms, right? And so this orientation in here is stabilized because, again, you are in a local minimum of free energy. And it costs energy to introduce bosoms. Therefore, the system doesn't spontaneously, the particle doesn't spontaneously rotate to this orientation, right? So we can see already from this example that the defects can simply appear to reduce elastic free energy, and even in the case if they are not required by topological constraints. However, at the very same time, they still manage to satisfy those topological constraints, because as you can see from this example, you have 2 +1 defects and 2 -1 defects, so their winding numbers still add to 0 as you would expect. So now if we change the genus to 2, so we will observe more defects, as you can see. And so you can see those defects in here around the G equal to handle body. Again, as you would add the winding numbers corresponding to those bosoms, they add to what you would expect. You can do the same for the particles with different genus. And here equals 3, 4, 5 numbers of holes, right, that correspond to different Euler characteristics. And as we characterize the winding numbers of bosoms, we see that they all add to what you would expect based on their Euler characteristic, right? Despite the fact that you have multiple different ways of satisfying those topological constraints. So say for a single ring, you can have no defects, or you could have 4 defects, 2 +1s, 2 -1s. For a ring with genus equals 3, you could have, for example, 2 +1s and 6 -1s, or 4 +1s and 8 -1s, right? And so again, those different combinations in here appear because you can have local minima of free energy that would correspond to different ways of satisfying topological constraints. What's also interesting is that as we look at the details of the structure of bosoms, we can see that they can split into half rings of disclination lines. And so this can be understood if you look at the schematic in here, right? So the two-dimensional director field configuration at the interface of the particle and the liquid crystal corresponding to this bosom is equivalent to that of this semi-ring of disclination that's going to the bulk and coming back to the surface. Yeah?
So that, the radius of that disclination rate matches the composition of the anchoring elasticity.
The defect core radius is where the scalar order parameters going is reduced. So I believe Oleg discussed this in some details for disclination lines, right? Yeah. All right, and so so you can see that those two are topologically equivalent. And in the case of strong surface anchoring boundary conditions, we can observe that the point defects on the surface of particles are simply splitting into half rings of disclination lines. So now I will show you a couple more examples using droplets with different genus and different Euler characteristics. And so again, we can we can fabricate droplets that have a shape of rings, as you can see in here. In those, we don't need to observe topological defects at all, as you would imagine. And so you can map from experiments the director field around, which is depicted in here using colors. This corresponds to this type of director field in the particle. There are no defects in this case that are required. Now, however, as we go from genus equal 1 to genus 2 handle body, we can see that now the defects appear in here, and the defects that are observed are actually not the point defects for those micron-sized handle body shaped droplets, but they are line defects which run across entire depths of the droplet, right? They're in here and in here. And so you might ask, what do they correspond to? So let's remind each other that this point surface defect in here is equivalent to a semi-ring defect. And so you can imagine this semi-ring simply stretching to go all the way across the depths of the handle body shaped particle droplet, which indeed happens in here. And so this is observed for particles which are relatively small, only with the size range of micrometers. And so again, we can yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's indeed the case. So the defect lines of this type are stable for micrometer-sized droplets, but as you go to tenths of micrometers, they already go back to Boulder, and there have been other beautiful studies on a related subject which were done for hundreds of micrometer-sized droplets or millimeter-sized droplets, where indeed they also saw Boulgers. So Alberto's, for example, yeah. So this is a good question. We did not yet explore entire spectrum of geometric parameters, but in this particular case, the cross-section of our droplet is rounded square, and we can see that the double twisting is not present in this case. All right, so as we would do this kind of study for the droplets of different genus, again, similar to the case of colloidal particles with different genus, we observe that we satisfy the topological constraints. So, so far we considered only tangential boundary conditions. And what happens if the molecules at the particle surface would be forced to be perpendicular to it? So we can fabricate silica-based colloidal particles with different genus. So in this case, it's 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Again, do three-dimensional imaging, reconstruct director fields. And so now we can see not the surface point defects or line defects, but the bulk defects around the particles. So in here, you can see, for example, around the single ring, you can have a point defect in the center and the ring defect around it, or you can have two ring defects. So different combinations are also possible as you look at particles of different genus. And so I'm reminding you that the topological defects in liquid crystal, the point defects, can have sign plus or minus because they are in a line field, not in a vector field. But in order to determine their relative charge, we typically would need to vectorize the director field, right? And so this is what we will do in our study. Now, we can rotate those particles as we apply electric fields, and with that we can see the defects transform. So in here, for example, the ring is aligned perpendicular to the far field director. As we apply voltage and realign liquid crystal director, we then see the particle rotating and defects transforming compared to what you have seen before. You can rotate such particles also continuously and see how exactly this transformation of defects happen. But at all stages, we can map the director field and characterize the topological charges that correspond to those defects, right? And so what we find is that, again, they always satisfy the constraints that are provided by topological theorems. So the defects that you can see in here depicted by different colors have different relative signs, right? Which we will determine by vectorizing such a director field texture and then mapping, surrounding each of those defects by a sphere and mapping the vector field to the order parameter space. Now, then we can see that the topological constraints are satisfied, and what it also tells us is that we can define topological defects in the bulk of liquid crystal of interest by simply choosing particles of right genus because of that simple relation, right? So I'll not go through details how we can do also something like this using droplets, but you can imagine that we can also define perpendicular boundary conditions on the surface of droplets, and then we can observe many different combinations of defects that occur, again, always satisfying topological constraints. So for example, for a single ring, you can have an escaped configuration that previously you discussed already for capillaries, for example, right? So in here is just for a ring-shaped droplet occurring in this case. But as you would, this happens for relatively large droplets with a large cross-section, but as you go to micrometer-sized droplets with the cross-section micrometer or tens and 100 nanometers, you can see the defects occur because of the boundary conditions defined on the surface of the droplet. And so in a very small range of sizes, which are 10 to 50 nanometers, you can actually have stabilized singular defect lines in here, integer strengths. But as you increase the size of the cross-section, then you typically have two half integer defect lines that have that correspond to opposite hedgehog charges. And so in here you can see comparison of experimental and computer simulated polarizing microscopy images, and also the maps of director field at the surface that are presented using the different colors. So different colors of arrows defining orientation of director correspond to the different colors on the surface of particle, of the droplet. But what's interesting is that not only you can have rings. It's lower in energy, yes. Because the energy corresponding to a defect line scales as S squared, where S is winding number. So this is for large sizes of cross-section of droplet, this is energetically favorable.
Oh, I see, because the logarithm becomes a big thing. Because I guess each of this is multiplied by logarithm of the size of the system divided by time. So something very small.
Well, I mean, this is a bit more complex because it's not a 2D geometry, right? It's but
There is some calculation.
yeah. I mean, you can see it from minimization of Landau-Dejean free energy, but you know, you can explain it in simpler terms, you know, along those lines. All right, so we can also have rings that are linked with each other and also shaped as knots that still satisfy the topological constraints, because in this case, for example, the net hedgehog charge corresponding to such a defect is equal 0. And in the case when you have two rings like the ones in here, they are of opposite hedgehog charge and compensate for each other. So in principle, we can realize those droplets with different types of torus knots that are defect lines and shaped as torus knots inside of such droplets. It's all dependent on how you quench from isotropic phase, right? And so you can again stabilize the system in a local minimum, then the defect lines cannot easily cross each other and they are trapped in one of those states. Right. Right, yeah. But I would suggest some of those questions maybe keep for the break, because I see that time is running and there are a lot of slides to show. So in terms of energy, as we just discussed, so we would compare the free energy of two rings versus escaped configuration that I was showing you before. You can see that the free energy of two rings in small size for small droplets is lower, so those are realized up to a cross-section radius of about 1 micrometer or so. And then for bigger droplets, the free energy corresponding to escaped configuration that I was showing you before is lower, and so those type of configurations are realized, right? But they both satisfy the same topology. So now if we have the droplets with perpendicular boundary conditions of non-zero genus, then the topological defects are required. You cannot have, for example, escaped configuration without defects, and so the simplest way, for example, for this genus 2 droplet is to realize a point defect in here, but there are also other ways, right? So this is for large droplets when you have escaped configuration and only point defects. But for smaller droplets with relatively small cross-section, you can also have line defects that can be shaped in many different ways, because, again, you can have local minima of free energy. And so in here, we depict just one of them, right? And so as I already mentioned, we can do imaging of director field using different techniques we discussed. And we can, again, observe a similar type of behavior as a function of the size of the droplets in both computer simulations and in experiments. So just like for the single ring droplets, for double rings that you can see in here, you can see that the escaped configurations are stable for larger droplets, and the ones with singular defect lines stable for smaller droplets. This can be understood because those double rings are essentially very similar away from this intersection region. And here, very similar, but outside of this region, they are very similar to single ring droplets we already discussed before. And so for droplets of all different genus and Euler characteristics we discussed, we see how the topological constraints beautifully work. So some of the other examples of higher genus droplets are shown in here. Now, we would like to also go beyond the two-dimensional types of geometries that we discussed so far to more complex geometries of particles. And so in here, I show you the colloidal objects that are shaped as trefoil knots, for example, or other torus knots. And those torus knots are typically characterized using two numbers that you can see here in parentheses. One number tells us how many times you go through the hole of the donut as you are building such a knot, and the other number tells you how many times you go around the axis of the donut, right? And so you can see that we can fabricate such colloidal objects using two-photon photopolymerization that are micrometer size, so they are colloidal objects. And the question we want to ask now is what type of defects we can induce as we introduce those particles into the liquid crystal medium. So first question is, what's the Euler characteristic of a torus knot like trefoil knot in here? So in order to determine it, we can cut the knot, provided that later we glue it back together, right? And so as we do it, we realize that it's actually similar to that of a ring or a donut. And so that means Euler characteristic is equal to 0, which means that if we induce some defects inside of liquid crystal, the charges or winding numbers of those defects will have to add to 0. So let's study.
How do you define Euler characteristic? I mean, I think of it as for a surface. How do you define it for?
This is a surface. It's a surface of a knot. So it's not just simply.
You thicken it to
right. In experiment, it's always, All right. So in here, you can see such a trefoil knot-shaped particle between cross polarizers in a liquid crystal sample with the far-field director being uniform. And you can see already the Boulder defects, because in this case we defined tangential boundary conditions on the surface of particle. And those Boulder defects are visible in all kinds of imaging we do. For example, without polarizers or with an additional phase retardation plate like in here. And also when we do three-dimensional imaging of the director field, we can then reconstruct, for example, the pattern of liquid crystal director at the interface of this solid object and liquid crystal. And so this pattern is represented using this color scheme that defines orientations, the mutual orientations of liquid crystal director. And the points where different colors meet correspond to surface defects, the Boulder's, right? So what's interesting is that as you would rotate this kind of object and view it from different sides, you would find that there are 6 +1 defects with winding number +1 and 6 -1 defects. And naturally, they do add, the winding numbers add to 0 as we expected, right? Now, for more complex torus knots, again, we can test the same principles work. So for example, for this one, we have 10 +1s, 10 -1s. Again, the topological constraints are satisfied. But what if we define perpendicular surface boundary conditions? And so in this case, we see not the surface point defects, but bulk line defects, which are shaped into rings. And interestingly, those rings are also knotted. right? So in here you can see the particle itself is presented as this semi-transparent tube, and you can see the defect lines presented using green and magenta colors, right? You can see those defects in here in simulations, but also in experiments as we follow those darkish lines in multiphoton fluorescence-based images, right? And so as you refocus, go through the depths of the sample, you can see those defect lines following the tube of the particle, and you can understand why those defect lines are induced, because the boundary conditions on the surface of the tube of the colloidal particle are perpendicular, and they essentially compensate for the winding number due to the boundary conditions of such a particle. So you then have two minus half integer defects running and following the tube of the particle. In addition to knot-shaped particles, we can also produce colloidal links. And so the simplest one is so-called Hopf link, where you have two rings linked with each other. So those are Brownian particles. As you put them in water or in liquid crystal, they undergo Brownian motion. The second type of link is a Solomon link in here. As we put them inside of liquid crystal, we can see that, say, for tangential boundary conditions, we induce bosoms, and the particles align and localize with respect to each other to minimize the overall free energy of liquid crystal distortions introduced by such particles. So as we would probe the Brownian motion of particles away from equilibrium, we can invert the distribution of particle positions and orientations, and from that we can reconstruct the free energy corresponding to that local or global minimum of free energy, right? So this is presented in here in this graph. And so as we then reconstruct the director field around such colloidal links and compare also them to predictions of computer simulations, we see a good agreement. And so in here you can see the two particles, ring-shaped particles linked with each other that correspond to these experimental images. And the colors again represent the maps of the director field at the surface of those solid colloidal particles, as you can view them in here using different perspectives, right, from side view and two different top views. Again, the topological theorems are satisfied in here, but a lot of different beautiful possibilities can appear when we have perpendicular boundary conditions. So in here you can see two rings.
So if I may suggest, we should try to have a brief break, just so...
So maybe in 5 minutes I have a couple more slides on this part.
Okay, just to find a good part.
All right, and so as we have perpendicular surface boundary conditions, we can see that the defect lines can jump, for example, from one ring to the other ring, and this you can see both in experiments and in theoretical model, which is based on minimization of Landau-Dejean free energy. And so you can follow those rings and reconstruct the minimum topological model, which in which you present the colloidal particle rings in blue and yellow color, and all the defect rings using red color. And so you can see that they are interlinked with each other. So many different combinations can arise. Again, all of them would correspond to some local or global minima of free energy. And so in here you can see another one with two rings linked with each other. This corresponds to this configuration of defect lines and director field, which in terms of minimum topological model is presented in here. And what's interesting is that most of those rings are linked with each other, but one defect line which you can see in here, could be actually pulled away from those rings by laser tweezers, for example. So this is yet another example of a Solomon ring colloidal object where we have two particles double linked with each other. And again, you can see the defect lines following the shape of the tubes and linked with each other in different ways. So the diversity of different structures is very rich. And in order to summarize it for just one type of rings that we produced, which is the simplest Hopf link, we created this table in here, right? So what we have is topological presentations for the objects, colloidal objects, which are blue and yellow rings, right? Those are the particle rings which are linked with each other. And then all the defect rings are presented as red rings. And so you can see that they can be in different ways linked with each other. We can have different number of defect rings induced in such a system, which can range from 4 to 6, for example, here. The graph presentations, which are even simpler, that are shown below, show you how those rings are linked with each other. So whenever we have link between different rings, there is a black line connecting them. And so the particle rings, which are blue and yellow, are always linked with each other. But the defect rings can be linked or not. And you can see that many different complex combinations can arise. And this is despite the fact that topology of the object that we introduce in all of those cases is simple, the same. The topology of defect lines that we are generating in all of those cases is different, yet topological constraints are satisfied. So I will probably stop here, and in the next part we'll discuss the topological solitons, but if there are questions related to this part, I would like to answer now. Yeah? Yeah, it's a very good question. So in all of those studies, we took care of defining conditions which would correspond to uniform far-field director, right? So in a sense, you are working with the bulk liquid crystal away from surfaces, so that confinement does not matter much, right? But you're absolutely right that even more complicated configurations of director fields and defects can occur when you constrain such particles by confining them into thin cells, because then there will be this additional interplay with boundary conditions on confining substrates. Yeah?
So these knots they all have homeotropic boundary conditions, so topologically they should obey the links. So then when you have at the bottom here these two toroids that are linked together, and then you have these 4 ring defects on the outside, is it that the ring defects, like 2 of them have a +1 charge and then 2 of them have a -1 charge?
Yeah, so they are all obeying the topological constraints as I mentioned, but you can see the large diversity of ways to do it, right? And so you can induce many additional defects that self-compensate for each other, right? Or you could have defect rings that have 0 topological charge. So there are so many ways of doing this. And this would not be possible if you were to have a vector field in here, right? Because all of those defect lines would not be possible at all, right? The half-integer defect lines. So this is really unique for line fields which we have in nematic liquid crystals, but also that in many other physical systems those play important role as well. But we can use a nematic liquid crystal as a model system to study how something like this can occur.
Okay, so in the case where you have compensating charges, is there a relationship between, say, the curvature, like where they would find them on the torus, or like say with the negative curvature give rise to
Right. So it's a good question. You can see the general tendency is, and that can be better seen from images like this. The tendency is for defect lines to follow the tube of the particle, right? They are not localized in particular locations like point defects were that we studied before. But they can still interlink with each other and with the particles themselves in many different ways, right? Like, for example, in this case, you could see that this defect line jumped from one ring to the other. And this all of those structures that we looked at here, they correspond to some minima of free energy, right? Which are separated by thousands of K-Boltzmann T energetic barriers, right? So the system, until you heat it to isotropic phase, doesn't transition from one state to the other state. But, again, we can heat the liquid crystal to isotropic state, and we can see that each time we cool down, we can generate different configurations for even the same rings. All right, so break.
Couple minutes break. why don't we, yeah, we can do that.
I mean, we have the abstract. We could just send a link. If people agree to put the PDF.
Okay, sounds good. So I'll send an email to everybody and ask them to
Right, but like sometimes in fact, there's like it's like about one method and not one method.
Okay, let's reconvene. So in the second part of my talk, I'll discuss different types of topological solitons. I would like to go all the way back to Gauss times when he had an idea that if you were to have a knot in a physical field, like magnetic field, for example, shown in here, then if the field lines were not allowed to cross each other, you may have something like a particle. Later on, a similar kind of idea was developed by Kelvin and Tate, who actually thought that the atoms that we know and see in periodic table of Mendeleev are nothing else but different types of knots in vortex lines. We of course know that this type of model is not true, but this original model, one of the first models of atoms, resulted in a lot of excitement and eventually in the development of the so-called knot theory, mathematical knot theory. What's also interesting is that much later in time, this knot theory was used in many different physics theories, as well as physics provided a lot of additional insights into understanding of mathematical knot theory. And many of you might know that Ed Wheaton, for example, is the only physicist who received the Fields Medal, the highest honor for mathematicians, which is precisely for providing those additional insights into mathematical knot theory based on physics. And so today in my talk, I'll discuss how we can generate different knotted field configurations inside of liquid crystals. What I would like to start from is, however, to remind you about different types of spheres we can have, right? So two-dimensional sphere S2 is known to everybody. S1 is just a circle. And then we can have higher dimensional spheres, like three-dimensional spherical surface in 4 dimensions. And although it's hard to imagine how it would look like, but mathematically we can define the surface as a surface equidistant from of points equidistant from a center using this simple expression in here. If we were to live in a two-dimensional world and would want to know everything about a two-dimensional spherical surface, we could use stereographic projection to project to this two-dimensional plane, right? And although we don't know much about S3, we could use a similar principle, right? We could do the stereographic projection to three-dimensional space in which we can see. And what's interesting is that as you would project from that S3 surface to 3D, you would get linked circles, as you can see in here. And this is something that I've asked Paul to show you how this works as part of his demonstration later on during the lab tour. Why is this interesting and why is it related to what I'll talk about? Well, I'm sure many of you know about the skyrmions in ferromagnetic systems, right? Those would be localized objects, topological objects similar to the one I shown here. And you can obtain one of those by simply doing stereographic projection of the vector field from the spherical surface in here to a two-dimensional plane. right? And so you can see this topological object is protected by topology because you cannot eliminate it by smooth deformation of vector field, like magnetization field, for example. Now, you can obtain different types of skyrmions by simply smooth deformations of this vector field, either on the spherical surface or in the two-dimensional plane, right? So those are nothing else but two-dimensional solitons, skyrmions, often also called baby skyrmions. Now, if we do the same by projecting stuff from S3 to the three-dimensional space, we can obtain a three-dimensional soliton, which is often referred to as a Hopfion, right? And again, in here, as you already remember, the circles of the field lines are linked with each other, so it's topologically protected, and you cannot easily eliminate it until you do something like heat the sample to isotropic phase, for example, in the case of liquid crystal. Now, the topology in here is really beautiful because inside of such a Hopf vibration or Hopfion, you can have those nested tori that on which you can define circles all linked with each other, and Paul will show you how he obtains it by doing this projection from S3 in his simple computer model. Now, because it's something so general, obviously it became part of many physics theories, but realizations of such three-dimensional solitons, static solitons in physical systems, are not very frequent. So let's, however, go back to two-dimensional solitons, the baby skyrmions, and understand a little bit more about their topology. So such objects can be characterized by the so-called skyrmion numbers, right? Because you remember we obtained it by stereographic projection from spherical surface. So now if we map this vector field into the order parameter space S2 sphere, we will cover it once, right? And so that's defining the skyrmion number 1. But you could have different skyrmion numbers. For example, in this case, if you twist more than once as you go from center to periphery. And so this would correspond to covering such order parameter space, the S2 sphere, twice, right? So we can realize those objects in liquid crystals as well. And in here you can see a map of director field corresponding to this object, which is imaged experimentally using multiphoton fluorescence imaging. So as you can see, when you go from the center to periphery, in all direction, you rotate by pi, the director. It's equivalent of the skyrmions that we just discussed, and has this translational symmetry along the axis of this double twist tube. Now, how about the three-dimensional skyrmions? We can realize them in chiral nematic liquid crystals as well. And so in here you can see the so-called Pontryagin thumb construction that corresponds to such solitonic structure, which is obtained using computer simulations, and another one which is done based on three-dimensional experimental imaging of the director field. And the colors in here, as we already discussed, all tell us about the orientation of director and liquid crystal molecules in this three-dimensional space, right? So how do we generate those kind of structures inside of liquid crystal media? So we all know that liquid crystals respond to all kinds of external stimuli, including 1 volt or so of external field. Nowadays, you can even produce flexible displays where we use this effect of response, right? But if you shine a laser beam of light inside of liquid crystal medium, we have quite strong electric field of the optical wave as well. And so we can have the so-called optical Friedrichs transition, where we realign director due to its interaction with this light, right? And this is again to minimize this term on free energy in free energy that you already know everything about from previous lectures. Now, in order to realize structures I discussed, we use not just liquid crystal, but chiral nematic liquid crystal, which is composed of molecules like 5Cb, but additionally doped with chiral agents. The molecules very similar to 5Cb, but having this chiral center that breaks the mirror symmetry, and so we obtain chiral nematic or cholesteric phases. And although this system would like to form twisted configurations, we can then confine this material in between substrates with perpendicular boundary conditions so that the twist is unwound and you have initially a uniform state. But we then will shine the laser beam inside of this liquid crystal medium and relieve the frustration of liquid crystal, which wants to twist but is protected from doing so by those boundary conditions, right? And so in order to do this, we also use so-called Laguerre-Gaussian laser beams, which are generated using the spatial light modulator in the holographic laser tweezer setup. And they are nothing else but screw dislocations in phase of light, or optical vortices, right? So you can see depicted in here. So as you would look at the intensity profile of such beams, they are very different from Gaussian beams that are most common, right? Because for the optical vortices with non-zero charge, you would have donut-shaped profile of intensity in the cross-sectional plane perpendicular to the beam axis, and those type of cross-sections along the beam axis. So as we shine such a laser beam inside of liquid crystal medium, the chiral nematic, we can generate all kinds of interesting topological configurations. And so you can see some of them in the pictures in here. I'll just now take a minute or so to describe what they are. So imagine you have a double twist tube, right? And so what you have in here, this is liquid crystal director, and as you would go from center to periphery, you would twist the director in all directions, right, as depicted. And then you can trace this director on the surface of the tube, which is done in here by those colored lines, right? Now you can take this double twist tube and loop on itself to create a donut, right? Now you can close those field lines into circles, right? And with this, you can create not only linked loops of the director field lines, but also different types of knotted rings, right? So for example, trefoil knots and so on. And with them, you can fill the space, right? So this entire volume of the double twist donut can be filled with such double twisted configuration. And so those do resemble the Hopf and Seifert vibrations, which are well known in mathematics. As we already discussed, we can realize them in our experimental system. Now, in addition to such structures, we can also obtain slightly different ones where we would additionally have point defects. And so in here you can see a structure which we refer to as a toron, which has this double twist torus and additional point defects. They are represented here using the Pontryagin thumb construction that we discussed before. So those different colors correspond to different orientations of line. And in terms of director field lines, this is what we have. The double twist torus, which is then capped with 2 point defects above and below. And in order to generate something like this, all you really need to do is to focus Laguerre-Gaussian beam of power 10 to 50 milliwatt or so for 10 to 50 milliseconds, and a structure of this kind assembles itself and is stable after this. Again, we can analyze it as a double twist torus with those 2 additional defects, and we can generate them of different kinds using optical vortices. So the question is, why is this structure stable? Well, initially, as you remember, we had unwound chiral nematic liquid crystal, which wants to form twisted nematic configurations because in free energy it has this chiral term, but it's prevented from doing so because of the boundary conditions. Now, however, as we shine a laser beam, from this local minimum of free energy, we can go to another minimum of free energy with such a configuration which has a lot of twist in it, right? Because this is a double twist torus entirely filled with energetically favorable twisted configuration. But then you additionally have those 2 additional point defects, right? So initially the chiral term was unhappy in the free energy, right? While we had no distortions, band splay was not present. Now, however, as we create this structure, the chiral term in here is satisfied, while of course this is in expense of introducing some band splay distortions and additional defects. However, although both of those configurations can correspond to global or local minima for this confined geometry, we can the barrier between them is thousands of K-Boltzmann T. So in order to make this transition back and forth, we need to use laser beams of light. In this direction, we can also go by applying voltage across the cell thickness, right? And so this stability of such configurations can be also understood by doing numerical minimization of free energy. And so in here, you can see a plot of total free energy density isosurfaces. And indeed, in terms of this free energy, you can see that inside of this double twisted configuration, we have low free energy density. But around it, it's higher. And in the location of point defects, it's relatively large. So we understand how we can generate those solitonic field configurations in a line field in a liquid crystal. But the question you may ask, could we also do it in vector field lines, right? And so the answer is yes. And in order to be able to do this, we disperse magnetic nanoplatelets which have magnetic dipole moments perpendicular to their surface inside of a liquid crystal host. And we can obtain a state where all of those magnetic dipole moments will point all in the same direction, right? So we then have magnetization vector field decorating the liquid crystal director field. And because the concentration of those platelets by volume fraction is relatively low, we still have elasticity very similar to that of liquid crystals, but of course the topological properties of defects that we will induce, for example, will be very different because we now deal with a polar system, right? And so, for example, we can obtain the hysteresis loops in switching such a system using applied magnetic field, both when this magnetic field is parallel to the director in the magnetization direction, right? And so when, however, you apply magnetic field perpendicular to far field director, you see no hysteresis loops. So in order to describe the overall free energy, we can have, which will correspond to elastic distortions of director field and magnetization field, we can have the familiar to you Frank Ozin expression for distortions in the director field, but then this additional coupling term, which will describe how the magnetization, which is parallel to director, is coupled to external magnetic fields, and also, so this is magnetic free energy term, and then also coupling term, which describes the coupling between director and magnetization field, which in our case is always very strong. Yes, so we will get to that.
Also, we're running a bit late, so can you give an estimate of when?
I think in 10 minutes or so I will finish.
Okay, we probably want to finish with 10, otherwise
Okay.
we miss lunch.
All right, yeah. And so we can then later minimize overall free energy using this expression for free energy. So now we can obtain domain structure, if we do not control far field magnetization. And, you can see a response in here of complementary domains with different antiparallel directions of magnetization with respect to each other in different domains. But what's important is we can also define the magnetization to be only in one direction. And moreover, using optical control techniques that I'll not discuss in details, we can define those monodomains in any shapes or monodomains in entire size of the sample. And here you can see magnetic monodomains in the form of CU, standing for Colorado University. We can also pattern defects in those systems, right? And you can understand that those are different from the ones that you would see in nematic because of the polar nature of the field that we are dealing with. But what's important is that as we dope chiral additive to this system, we again can obtain the frustrated situation before we shine the laser beam, and then using the laser beams we can generate those structures of torons that you're already familiar with. But in here they are now in the vector field of magnetization, right? So it's now in a vector field, and you can see that the vector field inside of such a structure is pointing up roughly, while outside it's in an opposite direction, right? This, of course, would not matter when we had line fields, right? But in here, it's a polar system, so it does matter, and this means that the point defects in here above and below the double twist torus are required because they are helping to match the far field vector with that inside of this toron structure, right? So now we can again use the computer simulations that Paul Ackerman does and can show you in more details to simply map the vector field lines corresponding to this structure. So this is a two-dimensional cross-section in the midplane of the cell, and those different colors correspond to orientation of vector field. And if you would choose particular locations, right, like somewhere in here, for example, and start tracing the vector field lines, you would realize that they close into circles, right? And as you would then move to another point and so on, you would realize that all of those circles of vector field lines are linked with respect to each other, right? And so again, they can be, those different circles then represented on the S2 sphere as shown in here by those different points. And in that way, they very much resemble this Hopf and Seifert vibrations that we discussed before. But in the case when we have such field configurations with not in the vector field lines, in this ferromagnetic system, the response to applied external magnetic field is polar. So you can see this from the data on the size of the toron as a function of applied field that I show you in here. Right? As you apply a field in this direction, which is matching direction of magnetization inside of the toron, but opposite to that outside, you can see that the torons are growing in size until they equilibrate at a certain equilibrium size. And then as you turn off the field, they would shrink back to the equilibrium size at no field. Right? Now, if you apply the opposite direction of magnetic field, instead, they shrink in size, right? This happens, and again, if you turn off field, they equilibrate back to the size at no applied fields. So this can be understood by doing numerical modeling and minimizing the free energy again. And so you can see in here that the match between computer simulated dependencies of the lateral size of torons and experimental is quite good. But what's also important to notice is that as you apply magnetic field in this direction above some critical value, you destroy the structure completely, right? Because it costs too much energy to have it existing there, so the system disappears. This configuration disappears. Now, what I will not be able to present, but maybe later on, for example, Paul could show you in detail during one of the student seminars, is how we can pattern and generate the defects in liquid crystals in many different ways. So all of those little structures that you can see in here are the torons that we just discussed, and we can create quasi-crystals and different types of crystalline lattices out of them that can be used as diffraction gratings. You can see examples of diffraction patterns in here, for example. If you generate defects like dislocations in such lattices, then you can use them as generators of optical vortices. So if you would use the Stokes polarimetry phase mapping setup as shown in here to map the phase of the diffracted beams, you would see that they are all optical vortices. So before we were using optical vortices to generate those structures, but now as we were able to generate periodic lattices with dislocation defects, we can use those periodic lattices to generate optical vortices as well. So this is a nice way of seeing the interplay between topological defects in soft matter and light. And so in here are more examples of 5-7 disclinations in hexagonal lattice and the optical vortices that you can generate using them as diffraction patterns, right? Now, the particles like this, when generated in liquid crystal, also the solitons like this, when generated in liquid crystal, also behave like colloidal particles. And so in here you can see them interacting repulsively from each other as we bring them close to each other using laser tweezers. And so we can control those interactions by applying electric fields to liquid crystal. And so at no field, due to those repulsive interactions, when we have many of such objects, we can generate hexagonal lattices. But then as we apply field, we do defect transformations, and they become looking like dipoles of defects. And instead of hexagonal lattices, we can assemble, for example, linear chains of such dipolar configurations, where in here the main object is such a topological soliton that we discussed. We can understand those interactions by measuring them using laser tweezers, and there is very rich behavior of such a system that you can control by applying external fields of the order of several volts. So you can go from hexagonal lattices to linear chains, and you can also induce non-equilibrium dynamics of such objects. So in here you can see how torans accompanied by so-called umbilical defects can spontaneously move in the sample in a single direction as you would modulate the electric field that you apply to the liquid crystal cell. And again, the details of that, as well as all kinds of other types of dynamics that we induce in this system, will be discussed later by Paul, perhaps. And so with this, I would like to conclude that the soft matter provides an experimental toolkit for exploring topology of interaction of line fields and vector fields with that of with topology of surfaces and defects. And I demonstrated to you that there is a beautiful interplay between the topological defects in laser beams of light and the ones in soft matter, as well as that topology can be a basis for controlling and understanding self-assembly. Thank you.
Let's rush off to lunch. Yeah, we're not.
It's not like a
It's not. Yeah, it's not. We don't have to sprint it. No, no.
Hey.
Very nice talking.
Oh, thank you.
I had a few questions.
Yeah?
Is this a bad time?
No, it's good time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for the Hopfield that you showed,
Mm-hmm.
is it right that the lines of the Hop vibration are lines in that case where the director field is pointing in the same direction?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in that case, but you don't have any defects. Like it's different from the Toron because you don't have any point defects.
Yeah, that's right. So in the line field, we realized the Hopfield without defects. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is that so? That means that there is no topological requirement for defects to.
Yeah, no topological refinement. Because you can smoothly transform from, the configuration that you saw to the far field orientation.
So I was wondering if instead you had and then I guess you could have other knots, other vibrations also without defects in a similar way.
Yeah.
But earlier in the first part of your talk, you said that the genus for different knots, for all the torus knots, is the same. It's 0.
Well, it's
Sorry,
Euler
sorry,
characteristic.
Euler characteristic
Yeah.
is 0.
Yeah.
So I was thinking if through the knot, if you have the container being a torus shape, and the walls of the if the container is a donut shape and the whole of the container passes through the knot, then will the Euler characteristic for different knots become different?
I'm not sure I understand. Can you draw maybe?
I was wondering if so this is the knot, and this is the same Euler characteristic as this. But if instead I have this is knotted colloidal
So
particle.
you're talking about particle, yeah?
Yeah, and if instead I have my container pass through the knot like this,
Uh-huh.
then I feel that I don't know for sure, but I wonder if.
So you're thinking about such a particle in a droplet which is torus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then I'm not sure, but I
Mhm.
feel that different knots,
Mhm.
this and this will not be equal anymore, and different knots might have.
You know, it's a different system in here, but one would need to think about it because you know, in here you don't have uniform director, which is along one axis, right?
Yeah.
Or uniform vector, depending on what system you consider. So if you
Like I could remove this part very far,
mhm,
so that the boundary effect does not matter. But here I could still
Yeah.
have this.
Yeah, but it still would be different because you know, if you had nothing in there, right, you could have a configuration. Say this is a cross section that the director or vector is just simply along the axis.
Yeah.
You know, and so then you have no defects required, right?
Yes.
But it's different from just uniform director field here, and so you are thinking about this geometry, right?
Yes.
And then you say, what if you have the surface here, right? Well, you know, so we can sort of analyze it part by part, right? So if you have the donut-shaped droplet, you don't require defects, right? You introduce in here, in a sense, you know, let me see. Suppose you would introduce a ring, right? You still don't require defects, right? You still don't require defects. Any ring you introduce, you don't require defects. Then, if you introduce not, you should not require defects at all as well. But they can occur.
Ron, that was very nice. I sent
Thank you.
Maybe we find some time to discuss.
Okay.
And there were millions of questions, but
Yeah, I
kept
know, but
interrupting you. I think
in a sense,
we already so much stuff. But yeah, it's fantastic work.
Thanks.
And I can tell you also some stuff we're doing now.
Mhm.
Not the LC, but the some topological mechanics to solve it in completely different context. You know, pieces of plastic, and we're doing these topological insulators with mechanics. But I think you may like it because it's all about solitons and defects. And
Cool.
maybe before I leave, I'm here for
Okay,
another couple
yeah.
of weeks if you're around.
Yeah, I should be around. Yeah.
And of course, I'm happy to learn more about it. I got
Thanks.
quite good exposure. Thank you.
I see. So it really doesn't take much.
Yeah, I mean, I believe there should be still no defects in there because, you know, I mean, energetically they may appear, but topologically probably not required.
And I was thinking about Derrick's theorem. So does that that says that the defect should shrink if it's not stable using the theorem? And I was trying to calculate what makes it stable. And so the question, so what did you think boiled down to was whether this, so if the free energy has these terms, the Frank term, then the twist part that you said that makes it stable. So it seems to work if that twist part is times whatever you put it by p. If this thing is negative, as in I think that the twist term that you have is plus 2 pi by 2. So that means that this wants to be equal to minus 2 pi by 2.
I mean, you can have negative or positive depending on, you know, left-handed or right-handed. So this can be plus or minus.
Whether you put plus or minus here, if this will also want to be minus or plus. So this term should still stay, and this there will be a if it does stay negative, then it seems like spheric theorem works. But I was just wondering if
Well, not that it would be applied to liquid crystals, but people in, say, ferromagnets community discuss the stuff in terms of direct theorem, and its implications all the time, because right, without the chiral term, things would be not stable, but then with the chiral term, you stabilize. But then, it's easy to understand, more easy to understand the 2D defects, right? Where like this 2D skyrmion, baby skyrmion that I was showing. It's a simpler geometry and easier to calculate this. But I don't know how you calculated this for the torus, because in the case, when you have the cholestatic, it's more easy. But in addition, I don't know if you realize that our sample is confined, right? So that means, you have those boundary conditions and you essentially unwound it, right? So this is also like a little bit like you are in external field and you're inducing this soliton, right? Although you do not really apply, it's stable at no external fields, but the boundary conditions is what unwinds. Otherwise it would want to form a twisted structure. And so, so in a sense, then you may need to add more terms. But yeah.
boundary conditions could change this theorem or the application of this.
Right, in a sense. But in a sense, the same thing you could also do if you have no boundary conditions. You in a sense unwound your chiral nematic completely. And then you ask a question locally somewhere, how do I stabilize a structure like this, Because as I just mentioned, the action of those is somewhat similar to applied field, which has initial state then fully unwound,
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I want to ask a question. So you were telling us in the first part of the talk
Uh-huh.
that there's a topological, that there's a substrate and you have liquid crystal ordering on top
Mm-hmm.
of it. Could there be instances where the ordering itself, the orientation ordering itself, is comparable to the energy of the elasticity of the material, so that the ordering can change the topology, or so if you have a chiral nematic, it can form.
Well, yeah, in a sense, you have it. Let's see, we are still on.